So, Sonic the Hedgehog. One of the most popular video game characters to ever exist. Sonic turned 30 a while back, and in spite of the various issues Sega has ran into with the wildly ranging quality of Sonic games over the years, Sonic still remains as a highly iconic, profitable, and present video game character. So with this highly veteran video game character that has sustained numerous hardships and eras of video game history, you would presumably come to the conclusion that Sonic the Hedgehog has a highly loyal and dedicated fanbase. Well, you would not be wrong in that assumption. Shall we say, the Sonic fanbase is incredibly unique for a variety of reasons. So, without further ado, this video will be a deep dive and analysis of one of the more bizarre, prominent internet fanbases, that being Sonic's fanbase. More importantly, we must ask the question, why is the Sonic fanbase the way it is? Because that question does not get asked simply enough, and the strange behavior pertaining to the Sonic fanbase is too common for it all to be coincidence. So this is what I will seek to achieve in this video, digging to the center of the earth and seeing if we can find any dinosaur bones that make any sense. To initiate this understanding of the Sonic fanbase, we must know Sonic. Unfortunately for us, we cannot take him out to a nice steak dinner, but we can go in and find various informative sources to do extensive research to know him. I will not go into excruciating detail about Sonic, as we are here to talk about the people surrounding Sonic rather than Sonic directly. So we must go to Sonic's origins as a character.
ビュンビュンハリネズミどんなもんだでソニック登場この面白さったらもう目が離せやしないたまんないカットビアクションゲームソニック・ザ・ヘッジホッグメガドライブから
For this portion of the video, I will be laying down the groundwork of Sonic as a character and Sega in the video games industry. Sonic's first game was on the Sega Mega Drive, that being the eponymous Sonic the Hedgehog game, released in 1991 by Sega with the head programmer Yuji Naka. The reason why I said Sonic's first game instead of first appearance, as mere months before the game's release, he appeared as a keychain on the front rear mirror in the Sega racing game Rad Mobile. But we are getting ahead of ourselves here. Sonic the Hedgehog was originally designed to be the mascot for Sega as a video game company to directly compete with Mario, Nintendo's video game mascot. The reasoning for this was that Sega wanted to be a major competitor to Nintendo, as during this period Nintendo was the largest video game developer on Earth during the 1980s and 1990s. Nintendo was at its most dominant following the North American video game crash of 1983, in which the solely dominant video game company, Atari, had essentially collapsed, alongside many other American video game companies, due to an oversaturation of the video game market and a distrust of Atari products. So many poor quality games had been released in such a short span by third-party developers and Atari themselves, people just stopped buying consoles and video games entirely. The market had cannibalized itself to such an extent that the market for these products imploded. However, what is cited as the reasons that revitalized the video game industry was the release of the Commodore 64, personal home computers, and most often cited, the release of Nintendo's Entertainment System in 1985 is commonly stated as a large factor for the revival of the video games sector. In practicality, during the mid to late 1980s, Nintendo was the sole dominant video game company, and the only one average people were knowledgeable about and trusted. So this is where Sega and Sonic come into the mix. During the 1983 video game crash, arcade machines, which had previously been undergoing a hugely profitable era following the release of the highly beloved Space Invaders and Pong in the 1970s, they proceeded to have a steep decline in 1983, much akin to video game consoles as a whole. This led to thousands of arcade buildings to be shut down. At this point, Sega, which was founded in 1960, was originally a coin-operated slot machine. Now, these roots are still visible with Sega, as they still have various arcade machines and gambling-related activities, but it must be stated many video and game arcade companies initially set out as primarily slot machines, or general gambling companies. That knowledge to create video game hardware in its infancy does not come out of thin air. After all, Nintendo was founded in 1889, and I do not think they were making Donkey Kong games for a century before they released Super Mario Bros. But initially, Sega was set up by two Americans, that being Martin Bromley and Irving Bromberg, under the name Service Games. This is where the abbreviation of Sega originates, as the company was at the beginning a slot machine company for American Marines overseas. Initially, they had set up in Hawaii, but in 1952, the American government had made slot machines illegal in overseas territories. And at that time, Hawaii was an American territory and not a state. In response, the two moved to Japan and set up the company there as Service Games of Japan to operate as a gambling company for American troops stationed in Japan post-World War II. But then the company was dissolved into Nihon Goraku Busan and Nihon Kikai Saizo, so Bromley and Bromberg could avoid criminal investigations by the United States government and dodge the poor image of having numerous investigations of criminal business practices relating to their gambling operations and dodging US law. These two companies had 100% of the assets of Service Games of Japan, and then in 1964 merged into one company under the Nihon Goraku Busan name, but of course operating under the Sega name. I wonder why. Anyway, this organization would then move from creating slot machines to creating arcade machines during the arcade boom of the late 1970s, such as their copy of Pong, Pongtron, released in 1973 by Sega. There was a lot of Pong clones made during this period. Such rampant cloning and copycat products is one of the contributing factors to the collapse of the video game industry in 1983. With the ever-apparent collapse of the arcade industry in 1983, the president of Sega Enterprise Inc., Hayao Nakayama, requested that the then corporate subsidiary of Gulf and Western utilize its hardware capabilities and turn into home console creators. By July of 1983, Sega had released the SG-1000, a home video console, ironically released on the exact same day Nintendo would release their own console, that being the Famicom, otherwise known as the Family Computer, also otherwise known as the Nintendo Entertainment System. In 1984, Sega finally became a Japanese company after Gulf and Western had sold it off to the SCSK Corporation for $38 million United States dollars without being adjusted for inflation. These two examples in particular indicated a major shift that was occurring for the Sega Corporation that would go mostly unnoticed until years later, as the SG-1000 series and its successors would fail to obtain a market inside of Japan and had minimal presence outside of the country. Sega still had enough funding for its gambling and arcade machines to fuel the creation of further game console developments. Many did not have that privilege to do this and fell into relative obscurity at this time. This would continue until Sega would release the SG-1000 Mark III, otherwise known as the Sega Master System outside of Japan. The system would be remarkably more successful than its previous counterparts, but unfortunately for Sega, continually lurked in the shadows of the Goliath that was Nintendo at the time of its release in 1985. Keep in mind, when they released their initial console, it was immediately eclipsed by Nintendo the moment it came out, by their entertainment system release just a few years prior. And even if Sega tried to release something of significantly higher quality, they can't get any games on it, as Nintendo created these stringent legal agreements where developers would have to exclusively produce for Nintendo. This meant in a limited industry with limited developers, very few of them would want or be able to work on untested and less profitable consoles, ignoring the legal agreements Nintendo wrapped many into at this time. To counterbalance this, Sega simply developed their own games, and luckily the console did obtain an audience in Europe and Japan, even with Nintendo's ever-viewable presence. And by the late 1980s, the Master System was actually outselling the NES. However, what Sega internally viewed was that they had moderate successes, but not enough to overthrow the hegemon. There were three major reasons that can be stated for this, and Sega had to overcome all in order to instigate a video game revolution. Number 1. Console hardware. To convince people to move from a trusted and known name in the industry, people must be provided with a reason to move from them to something else. What this usually means is that the other product offered must be of undeniably superior quality to the trusted name. This forces people to migrate away from something to trust and into the hands of something that they can trust more. Not off previous glory, but off sheer numbers and logic. The second reason is game quality. Nintendo had in practice a total monopoly on what games could be made. The Nintendo Entertainment System was the only mainstream video game console people from America, Japan, and Europe were playing. These were the three largest video game markets in this period. So, if you wanted your game to have a large audience, likely profit, and trustworthy hardware, you almost definitely were going with Nintendo. So these almost draconian legal agreements in which you could only produce for Nintendo and follow their strict censorship rules regarding violence, swears, drugs, sex, alcohol, and so on, made sense in this brief period, as no one else was making games, so you had absolutely no real alternative. So Sega would have to obtain games or create games that were of on par or superior quality to Nintendo. But remember, with the first reason, it still applies here. So you cannot solely make games on the same quality, as brand recognition goes a long way. You need to surpass them, consistently and viewably. The third reason is less tangible, but would definitely play a large factor into Sega's marketing throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, that being icon status. Sega did not have a singular figure that they could connect their audiences with. For example, Mario. Mario games were so visible and so present with audiences, it was not difficult for a following for Mario to be established for Nintendo, as it was a recognizable character from a series of incredible quality and large accessibility for audiences. So, for a parent or a child in the mid-1980s, presented with 30 video games you don't know, you were probably going to choose Mario, off past knowledge and experience with Mario, guaranteeing Nintendo's presence culturally and economically. Seemingly, these three factors make it impossible to overcome Nintendo's monopoly, as they have all the video games, the market trust, and the icons. Nintendo had a self-fulfilling cycle of what seemed to be infinite control and money over the industry. However, this would significantly change with the release of the Sega Mega Drive, or the Sega Genesis if you live in America. This console, released in 1989, was an absolute game changer for the video game industry. Firstly, it was a 16-bit binary code console. As the Nintendo Entertainment System was an 8-digit console, the Mega Drive had an undeniable advantage when it came to game data and quality. Given that the NES could have a maximum of 256 values, and a Mega Drive could have 65,535, it was no contest when it came to console quality. The second factor is where Sonic comes into this. Sonic the Hedgehog was developed to be the most recognizable Mega Drive game, and utilizing the console's potential to the maximum. Sonic the Hedgehog was designed to demonstrate the graphical quality of the Mega Drive, the speed in which the game ran at, and it was a demonstration of all the superior qualities of the Mega Drive combined into one in a direct comparison to the Nintendo's entertainment system. This is why Sonic, the Blue Blur, his emphasis on speed, what would later be called in Sega's marketing as blast processing, was to show how much better technically the Mega Drive was, but also how much better Sega games were. And the games of the Mega Drive ties into this icon status Sega sought to achieve during this period. Sonic was advertised as the cool character that appealed to children of the 1990s. Sega was advertising itself as the console everyone should get, or go to the one friend's house who does. Sega was not as limiting when it came to violence, blood, drugs, and generally permitted more adult games. So Sega had this real edgy and seemingly iconoclastic image as the company that didn't make games for little children like Nintendo. Sonic was a rad character that was faster than Mario, cooler than Mario, and more awesome than Mario. On Sega's version of Mortal Kombat, there was the blood and gore that the arcade game was notorious for, which the blood and gore was lacking in the Nintendo port of the game. Sega's version outsold it 2-1. Nintendo in 1990 was forced by the American government to rescind its exclusivity requirements, leading to a flood of developers wanting to move to Sega's development and noticeably more liberal requirements. Sega appeared to understand the hip modernity and radness that was ever present in the 1990s culture, while Nintendo appeared antediluvian in nature as it clung to a console that was seemingly out of touch, on games targeted towards young children that preteens and teens did not want to play anymore, as it was no longer cool anymore. Sonic, almost immediately after its first game release, was elevated to icon status. According to this article released by The Wired in 1993, Sega owned 45% of the video game market and 66% of the European market. The article also states that Sonic is the most recognizable cartoon character in the US among boys, and is the third most recognizable character behind Michael Jordan and Arnold Schwarzenegger in 1993. In 1989, Sega had earned $800 million in annual sales, whereas in 1993, it had earned an estimated $3.6 billion US dollars, not adjusted for inflation, keep in mind. So within a decade of engaging in the video game console market, it became a direct competitor to Nintendo, an absolute juggernaut of the industry that is credited with almost single-handedly reviving the video game industry. Sonic and Sega were viewed as this interesting, modern, popular, and seemingly the future of the video game industry in the early 90s. With their apparently radical and out-of-this-world music, only heard on the Mega Drive, Michael Jackson tie-in games, and a urban legend of Michael Jackson's personal involvement on the music of Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Sega was seen as this game developer that pushed the envelope, even when Nintendo released its Super Nintendo Entertainment System that did have a superior graphical and technical quality than the Mega Drive. For some, it was seen as too late, as it was released in 1991, during the apex of Sega and Sonic. Sega and Nintendo during this period had an extensive rivalry and competition over primarily the North American market. This is commonly called as the console war, as Sega and Nintendo launched incredibly aggressive ad campaigns that sought to demonstrate why one console was superior to the other. Sega would create this bizarre yet intriguing MTV adverts on how the Sega Mega Drive runs slightly faster than the SNES and titled it Blast Processing. Sonic could run so much faster in his games than Nintendo could ever, which is why Sega did what Nintendo don't. However, this craze did not last forever, as Nintendo's development and success of handheld consoles such as the Game Boy, and not all were fooled by Sega's advertising relating to the Super Nintendo home console. The Game Boy had outsold the Sega counterpart, the Game Gear, and cracks began to show in Sega as a console developer. The add-on of the Sega CD, a CD drive attachment to the Mega Drive that could play actual live video for games such as Night Trap, despite the novelty of the add-on as an attempt to extend the Mega Drive's lifespan, it severely underperformed. As the flowing river of time continued and the 1990s went by, beginning in 1992, Sega saw where the river was flowing towards and began the development of another video game console. In 1993, they formed a joint venture with Hitachi to create a console under the codename Saturn. The Sega Saturn, as it was released, a very different name I know, was a 32-bit game console with a CD drive instead of a cartridge slot. Now, you would believe that the 32 bits would be a larger graphical and technical upgrade compared to the Mega Drive, and would be another example of Sega really pushing the envelope as it surpassed the Super Nintendo's capabilities significantly. CDs and DVDs were the future at this time, and cartridges like that used by Nintendo and floppy disks were a thing of the past. Well, the Sega Saturn would release in 1994, that November, in Japan, and release in 1995 everywhere else. The 32-bit consoles were already being made, such as the 3DO, albeit very unsuccessful, but everyone in the gaming industry knew where the developments of the market were going towards in the mid to late 1990s. As it was well known, Sony were going to enter the ring of video game console creation and was going to release a 64-bit console. Nintendo was also going to release a 64-bit console, so a 32-bit console seemed rather unappealing at this time. Too little, too late. Strangely, mere months before the Saturn would release in America and Europe, Sega would release the 32X, which was a 32-bit cartridge add-on to the Mega Drive, which also underperformed. There were minimal third-party developers for the system, and much like the Sega CD, it looked bloated and was more expensive than it was worth to play a couple of very good or alright Sonic games and other Sega exclusive titles. Sega had released the Dreamcast in 1998 with the help of Tatsuya Yamamoto of IBM, ahead of the inevitable and fearful release of the PlayStation 2, which would come out in 2000. Sega were not the only ones fearful of Sony's inevitable release, and for good reason. Nintendo was also dreading the once co-partner turned console maker. Much better chance of success than the last disk drive partner Nintendo had. The Dreamcast had a rake of issues in the development and conflict, signaling the increasing discomfort and uncertainty with Sega's future. Sega really needed to market this console as they reportedly spent $50 to $80 million in hardware development, $150 to $200 million on software development, and $300 million on promotional material. Those sheer numbers demonstrate the priorities of Sega as an organization going into the late 1990s. The emphasis on total promotion. So, let's look at the launch of the Dreamcast. It had issues immediately at launch. That being, Sega had a 75% drop in half-year profits right before the Japanese launch. This was then followed by a shortage of Power VR chips for the console. As soon as the console launched, they could not even fulfill all of the pre-orders of the already small and limited stock they had, due to difficulties during the creation process. Sega proceeded to halt the pre-orders. By February 1999, Sega had hoped to sell 1 million copies in Japan. They sold less than 900,000. Sega had promised the much-awaited major 3D Sonic release would come at launch, but it was delayed for several weeks. However, the North American launch was initially successful due to the enormous marketing campaign Sega had in America, selling 500,000 copies in 7 days. But this campaign could have only occurred due to the fact Sega still had the appeal residually in America, with their characters such as Sonic could be a flagship character for these advertising campaigns. Sega had released several games to large acclaim and sales. Some notable examples of the game could be Soul Calibur, Virtua Fighter, Shenmue, The House of the Dead 2, Jet Set Radio, and Crazy Taxi. But most importantly for this video, Sonic Adventure, an actual 3D Sonic video game. Most of these games were met with praise and intrigue, and the library of the Dreamcast seemingly and surprisingly stronger than previous Sega launches. Despite a myriad of issues, Sega had apparently done a turnaround and would be in a more tenable position than previously. However, sales steeply dropped following the release of the PlayStation 2 in the year of 2000, which is the most successful video game console of all time. Despite other strong releases such as Sonic Adventure 2, Sega had failed and was now, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. Ahead of the launch of the PlayStation 2 in the year of 1999, the president of Sega had announced that Sega will shift from hardware to software. Sega was no longer going to be a video game console developer and would solely be a third-party developer. By 2001, Sega had netted 4 straight years of financial loss in spite of the strong and acclaimed releases on the Dreamcast previously mentioned, and the recent release of Sonic Adventure 2 to much praise. In February of that year, president of Sega, Isao Okawa, would donate his entire stock in Sega to the company, totaling over $600 million as a bailout to save the company. A month later, Isao Okawa would pass away. Okawa's decision had single-handedly prevented massive layoffs and total collapse of the organization. Thanks to Okawa, Sega is still a major game developer, producing third-party games and primarily Sonic games to this very day. Now, I have spent an absolutely enormous amount of time detailing the history of Sega as a video game console developer. The reasoning for this is that the history of Sega and Sonic video games are largely wrapped into the culture and iconography of the 1990s, and that Sega's age of prominence is inherently conjoined with Sonic, as Sonic is the embodiment and representation of Sega. So Sonic is by his nature a representation of media, video games, and children's entertainment of the 1990s. And people who had grown up during the 1990s and early 2000s would find Sonic the Hedgehog a common feature of nostalgia and one of the icons of this period, ranging from the sort of radical counterculture of the 1990s to the strange, three-dimensional Y2K style of the late 1990s and the early 2000s. As the 1990s and very early 2000s were Sonic's most present period, as the rise of these two aesthetic styles were very much at the period of which Sonic was most present. Sonic, of course, is still around and is actually more prevalent than in previous years, with various films and highly approved games getting released. But I do not believe the recent upsurge explains the strangeness of Sonic's fanbase in any manner. What I believe is a large factor for this is the large slump Sonic fell into during the 2000s. Since Sonic is a figure that represents hip and youth culture of the 1990s, it's kind of hard to maintain that image as an icon character if it is so deeply wrapped into a certain period of music, lingo, and stylistic choices of that time. So when those styles become unpopular, it is very difficult to adapt. And that's where I think Sonic's image and reputation begins to take an interesting turn. And that since Sonic was no longer trendy entering the mid-2000s, Sega decided it would be easier and more profitable to take the routes Nintendo had done during Sega's prime, ironically enough. that being the shift towards younger audiences and younger children. Instead of advertising Sonic as a cool character for teenagers and preteens in the 1990s, they advertised and curated Sonic games for young children who would have been too young to play those earlier Sonic games, or might not have even existed when those games were made. This is where I sincerely believe the crux and explanation of the Sonic fanbase is. Since Sega had collapsed and utterly failed as a console game developer in the early 2000s, and Sega began producing hit-or-miss Sonic games targeted towards young children in said 2000s, the Sonic fanbase became primarily people living on nostalgia. So many of the people who congregated around Sonic will be those utterly obsessed with their nostalgia and childhood to an extreme degree, or people with autism and naturally gravitated towards children's media anyway. What this means is that going into the era in which social media sites and the tail end of the internet's Wild West age, Sonic fan sites and the fanbase as a whole was utterly covered with children or adults with a natural gravitation towards children's media. This clearly created some very strange results, and the output and opinions of Sonic fans, which inherently created this strange and niche culture for Sonic fans in a sort of cyclical fashion, in which the strange culture and nature of large swaths of the Sonic fanbase made people leave and disassociate with the culture, leading to this unusualness becoming more visible over time, which of course is a self-fulfilling prophecy that seems to enlarge the cause that initiates this cycle. What did not help was the creation of the Sonic irony cult. Now, before I elaborate on how this began, I must first clarify what an irony cult is. They are a phenomenon that has largely been prevalent during the internet age, and what I would argue primarily post-2000. Essentially, what the idea of an irony cult is a group of people constantly sharing, talking, discussing, or viewing media they deem to be of poor quality or of general dislike. However, in spite of the disdain of said medium, they continue to watch it. They continue to engage and consume said medium. I believe examples of this could be Garfield, Shrek, The Room, Jerry Maguire, etc. The YouTuber and journalist JJ McCullough did a very interesting analysis of various irony cults, but what he had argued was that there's some deep-rooted nostalgia embedded within these irony cults. He also stated that he believes there is an inherent enjoyment of this product by this fanbase, as you do not create artworks, inside jokes, groups, consistently and constantly investing so much energy into something you dislike. Most people are not that self-masochistic, and given how common they appear, I would argue the internet has not made people more masochistic, unless I am given data to prove otherwise. Given that Sonic was a once popular character in the 1990s of a once hugely present game studio that for a period was relegated to mediocre children's games with a bizarre cultish following of very loud children on the internet and extremely troubled, lonely men, it was the perfect breeding ground for an irony cult to develop. What this led to was a surplus of people who would have grown up playing Sonic games or prior knowledge to Sonic, creating strange memes and idealization of Sonic. Also, given that this was the 2000s, another benefit for some, a small minority, but definitely a largely present factor, was that some of these people were given the opportunity to bully children and autistic people on the internet.
Okay, guys, I'm gonna fucking tell you fucking something. Don't defend this motherfucking green-eyed fucking bullshit. This guy is just fucking retarded. He looks fucking gay. His arms and legs are like fucking noodles. And he's a fucking green-eyed fucking...
So as a byproduct of the image of a Sonic fan and someone who loves Sonic became this sort of strange and uncomfortable amalgamation of children, ironic enjoyers, nostalgic men, cyberbullies, and cyberstalkers. Much like other factors, it became a self-fulfilling cycle that would only attract more people from each branch of the Sonic tree. Through this phenomenon, we were given many famous and infamous figures and creations relating to Sonic. Chris Chan, Tails Gets Trolled, Semi-Classic Sonic Fan, Sonic Diaper Guy, Gupto89, and so on. The list really is endless, and I mean endless. It does not help that during this period there was a rise of angry reviewers inspired by James Rolfe's Angry Video Game Nerd series and Doug Walker's Nostalgia Critic. For the purposes of this video, I will go more into James Rolfe's AVGN as it is more relevant. But during the mid to late 2000s, there was a slew of people on the internet trying to make hyperbolic and absurd reviews of video games they deemed to be bad. AVGN was really the first of its kind, as James Rolfe would review games from his childhood or generally older games and give them a fun, well-edited and special effects filled review with hyperbolic comments and extravagant swear-filled sentences referring to feces intercut with thoughtful and sincere critiques and reviews of games. So a lot of people enjoyed this style and desired to mimic it. And what else is a nostalgic childhood game that suffers from poor quality in the mid to late 2000s? That being Sonic the Hedgehog. So not only do you have the irony cult, angry children, internet trolls, and nostalgic adults, you now have a sea of people desperate for the fame and viewership attained by James Rolfe, making absurd, extreme, and incredibly angry reviews on Sonic the Hedgehog's newest releases. Some of these reviews were simply mocking the angry reviewer trend, but not all of them, which of course reinforced the prevalent image of Sonic fans of a group of angry, immature man-children, obsessed with an increasingly irrelevant and comically out-of-touch character. Sonic became a sort of symbol of an age gone and was now a representation of mockery. Sonic, in a way, is an embodiment of pastiche, that being the postmodern concept curated by Frederick Jameson. And that pastiche is a sort of parody or attempted recreation of previous styles without any meaning, in which Frederick Jameson argued that pastiche is an embodiment of postmodern styles and the collapse of modernism as an artistic and cultural movement. Essentially, we fail to understand historical periods and movements and lack the political meaning, or rather, any meaning of the initial works. Jameson stated that pastiche is akin to parody without any ulterior meaning or explanation. Just the presentation of certain styles or genres without an inherent explanation or reasoning. Just the presence of an object with what an outsider would understand as the objects that would naturally surround it. Just the presence of an object with what an outsider would understand as the objects that would naturally surround it. In a way, through irony and nostalgia, Sonic represents the embodiment of 90s culture. From the lens of a child during that period, Sonic in the 2000s had lost all original meaning and became morphed into this image of the 1990s still lingering in our time. So, by this nature, Sonic was altered from a 90s character to the concept of a living parody of the 1990s. And this is where I believe a large element for the rise of Sonic as an ironic character stems from. A character out of time and somehow an ever-present relic of pastiche, adored by a seemingly earnest and insecure cult of children and adults alike. Sonic the Hedgehog would not be the only character in this franchise to be parodied, obsessed, and enjoyed to an ironic extent during this period. In 2005, with the release of the standalone Shadow the Hedgehog game, Shadow the Hedgehog being Sonic's counterpart in the much-beloved Sonic Adventure 2 game. Shadow, for much time leading up to Shadow the Hedgehog, was an immensely popular character that carried his own internal fanbase within Sonic's fanbase due to his demeanor, appearance, and voice. Shadow appeared as the edgier, quieter, and for some cooler counterweight to Sonic that felt more relevant, less cliche, less childish. Shadow was interpreted for some as a character that was meant for older audiences than Sonic, So Sega, with the recent enactment of the 10 plus rating system by ESRB in 2005 as a way to differentiate games targeted for significantly younger audiences and those entering teenagerhood, coupled with the release of the PEGI rating system in Europe that same year. These rating systems were initiated by the upsurge of 2000s games that were obviously for more mature audiences than Mario or Sonic at that period, but were not mature enough to warrant it for 15-year-olds or, let's say, adults. Sega had room to create a more mature game for Sonic audiences that appealed to that middle ground of preteens and early teenagers that they once dominated a decade prior. This became the now infamous release of the Shadow the Hedgehog game in 2005, in which Sega attempted to capitalize on the rise of edgy preteen countercultures such as goths and emos in the 2000s, and alternative music. It created a edgy Sonic game in which Shadow is a morally grey character who has no time for happy-go-lucky individuals such as Sonic. Also, Shadow wields a gun in this game. Another detail about the game is that it's strange, since Shadow is meant to be a morally grey character, so you can choose to be a neutral character morally, a heroic character against the alien antagonists, or siding with the alien antagonists. However, these 10 possible ending choices are completely overridden by the fact that there is a true ending after you view all 10 endings, in which you see that Shadow was a truly morally righteous character anyway, defeating a major part of the marketing and the image of the game. The game sold over 2 million copies in its initial year and a half on release, on the tail end of the consoles it was released on. Within a year of its release, the PS2 and GameCube and the Wii and the PS3 would release, and it came out a week before the Xbox 360 came out. So, considering the position it was in, and that seems all too familiar for Sega, it did fairly decently financially. However, critically is a different story. It was mocked, it was ridiculed for its poor gameplay, bizarre game decisions, glitches, wince-worthy aesthetic, and stylistic choices that came across as trying too hard to be in touch with the youth. With this image of Shadow the Hedgehog as a cooler and supposedly edgier version of Sonic dramatically backfired and led to increased ridicule and ironic enjoyment, like that scene with Sonic. With Shadow facing extensive parody, instead of curating a hip version of Sonic that appealed to audiences Sonic could no longer, Shadow became a symbol of 2000s pastiche, as the 2000s were occurring. Sites like YouTube, DeviantArt, Twitter, Newgrounds, and other well-known Sonic fan sites would over the years congregate and mock Sonic, Shadow, and the other plethora of Sonic characters for their own personal enjoyment, or attempt to express adoration for Sonic, looking back at their childhood in their own unique ways. The apex of the unholy Sonic marriage of the unironic cult and the irony cult would reach its peak in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, as there had been another Sonic game in development, hampered by the release of the previously mentioned Shadow the Hedgehog. The now infamous Sonic the Hedgehog game in 2006. Sonic 06, as it is colloquially known as, was created by Sega as an attempt to modernize and reboot the Sonic franchise for the 7th generation of consoles, entering the latter half of the 2000s, and was rushed to be released for the 15th anniversary of Sonic in 2006. This is especially good time to release this game, as all the consoles were just being released, so it means that Sonic will be one of the first games to choose from for the Wii, PlayStation, and Xbox. So when people were buying their first video game for the consoles, for themselves or their children, a big bold Sonic the Hedgehog would be visible, an incredibly recognizable character people could trust to some extent. The game is widely considered one of the worst Sonic games ever released. It is bizarre, poorly made, glitch-filled, slow, incoherent, strange mess of a Sonic game, which was clearly intended to be a successor to the much-beloved Sonic Adventure games, harkening back to the Dreamcast. The game has obtained infamy in the years following, as it is considered one of the worst Sonic games, if not the worst games of the year 2006. And this game was seen as the embodiment at the failure of the Sonic franchise as a relic from the 1990s and as a pastiche object from children to grasp onto. Some very nostalgic-focused individuals believed Sonic should return to the old designs of the early 1990s. Those days were long gone, and many would only be appeased by one-to-one recreations of the games that they've already played. Within 5 years of being in a crisis, Sega was in another one, as Sonic 06 was meant to be the magnum opus of a new slew of Sonic games, and even though Sonic releases of late had been doing well financially, they were remarkably disliked and received monumental backlash for their mediocre at best quality, even actively disliked and hated by a small minority of extremely loud fans. Sega then, during this period in which the audience was perpetually morphing into a cascading sea of children, unhappy and rose-tinted, glass-eyed adults, pessimists and irony cultists, would enter into a strange period of development in which they would create a relatively decent Sonic game, followed by a subpar or bad one. Rinse and repeat this routine for a good few years until you reach the mid-2010s, in which, by this point, the strange, inept, and in some cases, disturbing Sonic audience was incredibly well known to the mainstream online communities. Sonic games, headed by producer Takeshi Iizuka, who had been working on the franchise since Sonic the Hedgehog 3 in 1994, the game in which some of the music was allegedly made by Michael Jackson, would release a game which could be argued instigated the current strange Sonic Renaissance occurring at the moment, that being Sonic Mania, released in 2017. What makes this game different from other Sonic games, aside from the fact it is a 2D game that resembles the original Mega Drive games that Nintendo didn't make, is that many of the developers of this game were not Sega developers. The development team of it was headed by Christian Whitehead, who, known by his online alias, The Taxman, was a Sonic ROM hacker and Sonic mod developer who in his spare time, along with others who later developed Sonic Mania, created mods and alterations of old Sonic games such as Sonic CD and the original Sonic games on the Mega Drive that made Sonic's fame. In 2009, Whitehead would make a functioning concept video that showed him operating Sonic CD on an iPhone. A game made to be used for a CD port on an add-on to a dying console in the 90s was now playable on an iPhone. Eventually, Whitehead would be hired by Sega to create ports for other retro Sonic games. In 2016, the 25th anniversary of Sonic existing and the 10th anniversary of the release of Sonic 06, Whitehead and his team would begin developing the game Sonic Mania. Whitehead and his team of fellow Sonic ROM hackers would begin developing the game Sonic Mania under Sega's wing. So as a natural conclusion of Whitehead's expertise, they developed a modern Sonic game that resembles the styles itself after the original Sonic the Hedgehog games released in the early 1990s. The game was quite a gamble for Sega, and quite an unusual decision to make, as they had done games recognizing the original games, such as Sonic Generations and the much maligned Sonic 04 games, which never got finished. However, unlike these games, Sonic Mania would do phenomenally, both critically and financially, receiving acclaim and extremely positive reception. Around this period as well, Sega had released the popular Sonic TV show, Sonic Boom, which was primarily targeted towards young children, but was still quite a popular show, and was well received for the type of content it was. Ironically, the Sonic fans who had been mocked for desiring a retro-style Sonic game were proven right. Now we reach our past few years, in that somehow and in some manner, Sonic is actually becoming a figure that is respectable of video games and general media. For instance, the unexpectedly well-received Sonic Frontiers, released in 2022. That is an open-world adventure game with Sonic in it, fulfilling a long-held dream by fans to make a fully fledged, three-dimensional, free-roaming Sonic game. much desired for decades at this point, since the never-released Sonic Extreme on the Sega Saturn. Among this is also the financially successful and well-liked Sonic films that have been released in 2020 and 2022, respectively. The idea of a successful Sonic movie starring Jim Carrey would have made sense in the 90s and would have been considered laughable in any decade up until a few years ago. Somehow, symbols of the 90s kindled a spirit that brought success. A symbol of pastiche 30 years ago is genuinely and sincerely popular. Maybe you could interpret this as being the decay of the supposedly late-stage capitalist society, and that our concepts of media and genuine qualities have deteriorated to such a point that symbols without coherent meaning and deep-rooted irony make sense to us now. I would disagree and argue that 30 years is a long time. So the people that would have grown up with Sonic at his prime will be in their 30s and 40s now. And so those people that would understand the appeal and origins of Sonic know how to appropriately use Sonic and create media that fits with this concept of modern Sonic. As well as that, the irony cult of Sonic began with the decline of Sonic media. So I would argue that it only existed out of this unacceptance and unhappiness with the downward trajectory of Sonic buried under this deep desire for enjoyment of the blue blur. I think this is probably the idea that ties all these groups that once were so vocal and active in relation to Sonic. It was a deep desire and a vocalization of the want for superior and good Sonic media. Whether that was from a child's perspective, a nostalgic perspective, or of someone obsessed with their favorite character. Everything was an outcry of the way in which the concept and the idea of Sonic was torn apart. This is why I believe the irony cult and visibly strange fanbase has declined over the years, and that people do not feel the need to be vocal about the way they feel Sonic should go, as it is going the way people want it to go. Because of that, the ironic enjoyers, the hateful pessimists, and the strange have been washed out with sincere voices that clean that poor image that once existed. Those unusual voices will always exist. They will never truly go away, but I do not believe they are or will be prominent as they used to be if Sonic and Sega keep their current trajectory. And knowing Sega, that could be as likely as a good roll in a slot machine. You could say that the Sonic fanbase is definitely weird, and to some extent it certainly is. But I suppose, in the internet age, if a group of people large enough love something enough for a long enough time, strange things are bound to happen. But the strangeness of the Sonic fanbase is a sort of blessing for Sega, in a way that for a character that was cool 30 years ago, has lost some relevance along the way, and has not had the best output of products, people still crave Sonic in a way, and people who don't seem to take an interest in those that do, for some reason or another. But for whatever the reason may be, and whatever the outcome of Sonic and his fanbase will be in 30 years' time, one thing, looking back, guaranteed on all of this, is to live and learn from the past. Thank you for watching.